Hello and welcome to another episode of Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins and I'm the Senior Manager for Education at the Bill of Rights Institute.
My name is Rachel Davison-Humphreys and I'm Director of Outreach here at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And we are fortunate this week to be joined by a member of our BRI's Teacher Council, Nicole Moretti. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Great. And so this week we're doing sort of what we did on our last 10th period webinar, which is a close reading, which is going to give us an opportunity to kind of dive into a couple documents that maybe we're familiar with, maybe we're not familiar with, but is certainly something that a theme that is touched on in a lot of classrooms across the country. And so we're excited to kind of dive in and pick that apart a little bit. So Rachel, is there anything we should know as we're getting ready to dive into our close reading?
Well, I think, first off, whenever we do these, we always like to think about what the purpose of a close reading is. Why are we putting these documents? Why did we choose the documents that we're choosing to put in front of students and use up our valuable instructional time? So when choosing the documents, it's really important that we think about what additional value do they receive from this particular document that expands or lets them explore in ways that they wouldn't be able just reading about the document. And I think we have a couple of really great examples here. So today's example, if you're interested in finding these, you can find them on our 10th period webinar website. They are part of a new resource that we're putting together, which is Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. It's a new resource that will launch at the end of this year that is very focused on primary source analysis. But the first one is Wealth by Andrew Carnegie, and it was written in 1899. And the second one is this fascinating document that I was not that familiar with prior to our lesson today, called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1877 by Edward Bellamy. So those two documents are the ones we'll be reading through. And what's great about these two documents is that they were written 11 years apart, right at the height of the industrial, kind of like the beginnings of the height of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the height of kind of this huge wealth creation period, and people asking, what does that mean for society? What does that mean for our world? And I think what inspires us to look at ththese documents is that there are a lot of very parallel conversations happening today. And we could name millionaires who speak like Bellamy, and we can name millionaires who speak like Carnegie. And I guess maybe we'd have to name them as billionaires or trillionaires these days, just. So again, we're presenting these to students and why we're presenting them, and then making sure that the two articles, if you are doing two articles, speak to one another. And so that's kind of framing our conversation. In order to do the close reading, it's really important that everybody have the same documents. And so our documents have line numbers attached, and we're going to be showing them on the screen as we walk through the two different documents. Nicole, is there anything more you wanted to talk about to kind of frame the conversation before we dive in?
I just think these kinds of readings are a really great way to pull your students in. They get to the point where I call it the Jell-O look, that blank stare, the drool coming down. This is a great way to introduce something, not textbooky, and they're short and they're engaging, and the kids can kind of get hands-on with them. And I don't have to be the sage on the stage, So yeah, I think that these are really important and a great way to kind of liven up your classroom a little bit.
What is important is that both of these documents are written in kind of natural speech. So I kind of wanted to start with that question: is who are these for? Because they're definitely written to one.
Yeah.
Who do you think the audience is for these?
No, absolutely. And I think just to frame a little bit more context, the word you were dancing around, Rachel, is the Gilded Age. And I think even introducing that term before you speak about these documents really says something about the time in which these authors are writing, because it's not a golden age and it's not a industrial age. It's known as the Gilded Age. Well, what is gilded? Gilded means it has sort of a slight dusting of gold around something that might not be so great, right? And of course, that term comes from an essay by Mark Twain called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, which is interesting too, thinking about Twain and his sort of social commentaries. And so, when thinking about this, Carnegie, in looking at both of these audiences, and I think looking at the author is always interesting because you can always, it depends on your viewpoint. You can offer, sincerity to Carnegie, for example, or you can offer, look, the guy's trying to justify what he's doing, right? And both of those can be an interesting lens through which to look at what is being written here and what is being talked about. And Carnegie, especially being, a self-made immigrant from Scotland who came over and worked his way up into being one of the wealthiest men in the United States, certainly had worked hard and accumulated a lot of wealth, and so was certainly defensive about how he came about that and protective of the system that allowed him to do that. At the same time, there are critics who are saying, look, you've gained this, but at the expense of what? And I think both of the authors here, both Edward Bellamy and Andrew Carnegie, are really grappling with that question.
So as we're going through these documents, we do have the chat box open. So make sure that if you want to ask us questions or want to engage together in the chat, KJ Hazlitt has already asked, who was the greatest robber baron and why? And that's actually something in our Gilded Age resource. We talk about the term robber baron versus captain of industry, right? It depends on what view of history, what side of which era, but not only just era, but what you think the role of the entrepreneur is, what you think the role of the individual is, and how you perceive and interpret their actions will change your view of robber baron versus captain of industry. So even the term robber baron has this really interesting historical context that you can explore with your students. I'm not sure we'll get to that question, but I think that's a great prompt question for students. And then say, who do you think is the greatest captain of industry? See if the student answers change. Yeah, okay, so diving in, which one do you guys want to tackle first? Do you want to tackle the one that's more familiar with Carnegie, or do you want to tackle the one that came first with Bellamy?
I may, Nicole, how about you decide? Because I'm too eager here.
I don't know. I kind of am drawn towards Bellamy right now.
Sure. I'm drawn towards Bellamy just because of the debates that have been happening recently.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there that sounds very familiar.
It does. And I did a little research looking at both of their backgrounds, and it's interesting when you said, who are these written for? The Bellamy became a bestseller, so it was really kind of written for the masses, about the masses, which is, so he comes from a pretty middle class New England background.
So if you're following along, this is looking backward. It's only 2 pages. It was printed, so it's a nice length for your students.
Yes.
And what this is in theory, it's a person who wakes up in the year 2000 Boston and speaks back to the year 1887, about the Boston of 1887 from the position of enlightened knowledge about the society of 2000. The action of what's happening?
Yep.
Yeah. So what does he do there? First, he paints this picture of Boston in the year 1887, right? In the days, especially the relations, perhaps I cannot do better than to compare society as it then was to a prodigious coach, which the masses of humanity were harnessed to and dragged toilsomely along a very hilly and sandy road. So he opens up with this analogy of a carriage, a coach, dragging society forward. What did you guys, how did you interpret, or what did that analogy do for you?
I really liked it. but he's really portraying, the downtrodden as being, run over by the coach and drugged through the muck, while the guys, the rich guys are on top, struggling to stay on top. I thought it was interesting. He did portray that the rich were continually struggling and jockeying to stay there, but could be thrown off at any time and drugged down with the masses.
Yeah, like lines 20 or so. It was naturally regarded as a terrible misfortune to lose one's seat, and the apprehension that this might happen to them or their friends was a constant cloud upon the happiness of those who rode. Go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say he's also, we were talking about, or Nicole mentioned that this was written for the masses, and I do think it's fun that this was, I think, the third most popular book in the 19th century after Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, which is another. It's interesting to see what were bestsellers in the 19th century alone. That could probably be a conversation. But also looking here at his point of view on the economy is also what is from that common man perspective, right? So he's looking at the labors of these individuals as being the thing by which he is assessing success or failure, which I think is an insight into how the rest of this piece then plays out. That's very much his perspective, in contrast to Carnegie, who's very much looking at it from a different perspective.
Right. And so that next paragraph, he gets into the labor theory of value. It goes very economic-y very quickly. So we're looking at lines 24 through 35-ish, through 40 really, trying to analyze, this one, 24 through 27, trying to analyze wage prices were set and now are set in the year 2000, according to his imagination of it. The cost of a man's work in a trade is what creates the labor. In your day, it was the difference in wages that made the difference in the cost of labor. Now it is the relative number of hours constituting a day's work. So he gets really economic-y. And I was wondering at this moment if this is still speaking to the masses, because it's a little, I have a pretty strong economics background, and this kind of came out, it's hard to parse this. What do you think the purpose of this section was?
Is it the value of the human that he's looking at here? And, I'm thinking, John Locke and the product of your labor and those kinds of things. Those are the things that came to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think his perspective is very much one of, look, it's the time it takes you to do something, not simply what is being produced, right? So it's a very much a fixed cost as well, right? It's being determined by something that doesn't seem to be the market. Right. And so if Carnegie is looking at, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute, but he's looking at this overall upsurge of goods. Here, Bellamy is looking very much at how is each individual being awarded for the merits they deserve in whatever capacity that is. And I do still think it is, I think what Bellamy is he's certainly appealing to a certain audience, but it does still feel like a mass audience. He really is still tapping into, I think, frustrations that individual laborers may have been feeling, or if they weren't feeling, people who were organizing labor at the time may have been wanting to express. And so he's really trying to tap into that in a real way, it seems to me. Because it's also kind of flippant, right? It's not like a serious kind of an academic or what you would think of as like a setting on a logical foundation, improving it. Is very much like, hey, you guys used to do it this way. It's a little, it's a little crazy that you used to do it that way, isn't it? Look how much better this system is, and it totally works because it's the year 2000. Which is kind of fun, it is a little heady, but it's also, I think, a little, lighthearted. Maybe is a weird way to. Yeah. It's probably a weird adjective to apply.
Again, I think it's written with its audience in mind, right? It's not a treatise on economic policy or process,
right?
But it tips its hat. Gives weight to that argument. So there's an ellipse in our version before we hit line 50. And I'm not familiar with the fullness of this text, but I'm sure it goes on quite a bit. So we're at line 50. Yeah, so there's this ellipse at the end of the discussion of economics, which then goes into what I found to be the most compelling part of this article, these two paragraphs, because I wrote in my marginal notes, true, question mark? Is this truly the condition of increased wealth? So I'm just going to read it if you guys don't mind. In your day, riches debauched one class with idleness of mind and body, while poverty sapped the vitality of the masses by overwork, bad food, and pestilent homes. The labor required of children and the burdens laid on women enfeebled the very springs of life. Instead of these maleficent circumstances, all now enjoy the most favorable conditions of physical life. The young are carefully nurtured and studiously cared for. The labor which is required of all is limited to the period of greatest bodily vigor and is never excessive. Care for oneself and one's family as to livelihood, the strain of the ceaseless battle for life, all these influences which once did so much to wreck the minds and bodies of men and women are known no more. Certainly an improvement of the species ought to follow such a change. In certain specific respects, we know indeed that the improvement has taken place. Insanity, for instance, which in the 19th century was so terribly common, a product of your insane mode of life, has almost disappeared with its alternative, suicide. And I was struck by this. It's very utopian. And so what is the cause of this utopia was my question. What is it that changes for his year 2000 that causes all the ills of a market society, as he defines it, to disappear?
And who's going to do the really hard labor?
I
wondered about that.
I think they do it, except only for the period of greatest bodily vigor.
Yeah.
So like 40 minutes. Like they go to the gym.
Right.
And when you're in your 20s?
I guess so.
Yeah. No, I mean, Bellamy is very much the Gordon Gekko figure here, right? Like he's saying, look, you know, this whole capitalist system is nothing but greed and following self-interest and selfishness, and that has negative effects. And Carnegie deals with this too, right? I mean, he touches on these. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But here, yeah, Bellamy is very much crafting, and he even says, you know, in the following line there, in I guess 61, you know, it finds a simple and obvious explanation in the reaction of a changed environment upon human nature, right? So they say, look, we got the system right. The old system was selfish and antisocial and appealed to this brutal side of human nature. But on the other side, we have this natural unselfishness that we should tap into.
And I wrote in my margins on that section that he is assuming the best in human nature. He's assuming the best in mankind, and that's all going to come out. And why it wasn't coming out in the 1880s, but it's going to come out in the 2000s, I don't know. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so
having lived through the 2000s.
Someone in the chat is asking, wasn't Bellamy a socialist, question mark? And I think that's one of those questions that you would hope your student would ask, right? Yeah. Because we don't tip that hat. We let the words speak for themselves. And you can ask, what are the underlying philosophical foundations? Like, what's the philosophical detection that's happening in this reading? How do you know what their values are? How do you know what their positions are based on the words that they use and the examples that they choose to use? So that would be my question for you all: is what evidence do you have that he is a socialist? Is how I would respond in the classroom to that question. And I mean, if we're now the students, I would say there is evidence, obviously, that he had serious interests in the consolidation of capital under the government and government distribution, and that's what the big sections in the economic section is talking about. Where did it say it?
You know, and he is writing in the time when the Marxist philosophies come out. and that view of history, of the class struggle, you know, of the economic constraints affecting people and influencing historical outcomes. So he is coming from that right in the middle of that time period. And he had been, you know, exposed to socialism and Marxist philosophies in his travels.
And in that paragraph, in the economics paragraph, between lines 30 to 50 or so, he is talking about the nation doing things, which is usually the language that, because that would mean that individual actors are not doing things, but the nation is.
Yeah, and his view on labor is very Marxist oriented, socialist oriented, you know, as is, and progressive too, right? Because he has a progressive bent in thinking, look, if we could just get these systems right, then human nature will prosper and follow, and we'll continue on, you know, down toward the end of history. And I think you're exactly right, Nicole. You know, all of those things are coming out, and all struggling with looking at the society around them and seeing this inequality and the very difficult circumstances in which people are laboring in too, in some of these factories, and sort of the cost of industry from that standpoint too, both physically and mentally. And I think it's interesting that both Bellamy and Carnegie touch on both the physical and mental effects of this, you know, economic expansion and industrial expansion too. And so, I think the utopianism too that you pointed to, Rachel, earlier is also a really interesting trend that you can pull in, you know, as you're having other conversations about even Bellamy societies that spring out from this, but talking about sort of utopian movements in America. I mean, this is certainly something you can pull back to and point to as further evidence of that.
Wasn't this was also about the same period as Kellogg and all the health movements that were like all of the sanitarium kind of utopian societies. There was this sense of the perfectibility of our systems and the kind of scientific improvement of systems and lifestyles.
Yeah, and which lends to fascinating comparisons today. I mean, earlier you mentioned different political conversations that are continuing on with this, which is absolutely true, but also just the possibility. I mean, we've lived in an age of great change and technological advancement, which makes us feel that we can do almost anything. I mean, I'm, you know, having this conversation with 3 people. None of you are in my home. That's pretty amazing. And so what else could we accomplish? And they lived through a similar period, right? Going from, you know, the sort of early ages of industry on into this period of advancements in transportation, in communication, in, you know, electricity. All of this is kind of an upsurge during this period. And that change, I think, is almost like a contagion of the age, right? I mean, it feels as though everything is possible. And Bellamy certainly seems to be tapping into that same kind of feeling.
And his rhetoric is so compelling. Like, that's what else is. I mean, I can understand why this is a bestseller. I want to live in the world of 2000 that he portrays. It's a beautiful world where everyone is happy and literally living their best lives. And that is encapsulated kind of in this. That happens in the last paragraph.
So, yeah, and that would be kind of my question to Rachel, you and Nicole. Why do you think he chose to write a science fiction book? I mean, why not write a pamphlet? What is it, you know, why do you think he went this avenue for conveying his message?
I think he was making more money writing fiction, actually. But, seriously, you know, he'd been an editor at papers, he'd written short stories, but as he gets a wife and a child, there's more money to be made in a novel.
Being a novelist.
Yeah.
I think the history of science fiction and social change is there is speculative in science fiction as a tool for exposing and taking trends to an extreme to kind of do a reductio on them and help people understand what the implications of their interests is as old as science fiction. And so I think that there's something that can be done for students too. I mean, this is why, 1984 captures them, and Fahrenheit 451 and Handmaid's Tale and all of those great kind of science fiction works help young people access something to critique about our society. Reading 1984 with students, or reading Fahrenheit 451 with students in this day and age where VR and AR are a thing that they live in, is a fascinating conversation to have, right? And I think similarly, reading Bellamy and other utopian visionaries is a fascinating conversation to have with young people about what is the potential and pitfalls and how do we explore those.
Well, there's no parameters either. You can go wherever you want with this. The sky's the limit, your imagination, he's looking at a society he would like to live in and that he would like his child to live in. I'd like to circle back to the slide that was up a few minutes ago, 35.
Line 35.
Yeah, where he's talking about, there's enough for everybody. There's a surplus and there is enough for everybody. And, he's talking about everybody partaking of the richness of everything that's out there. We should all, have what's out there. Doesn't everybody want that?
That's why.
And he's got a family. He's got, that's the world he wants to live in, and he wants his family to live in.
Right. Can we just read the last sentence and then we'll move on to because we have to move on to the Carnegie. But my friends, believe me, it is not now in this happy age that humanity is proving the divinity within. It was rather in those evil days when not even the fight for life with one another, the struggle for mere existence, in which mercy was folly, could wholly banish generosity and kindness from the earth. So he can't demonize them too much. You can't say everything. You can't say that there aren't good people in the world no matter the circumstance. And I thought that was an interesting way to end this section.
Yeah, he certainly believes in humanity.
Definitely. Any other kind of thoughts on the Bellamy?
I really think it's an interesting thought experiment for students to, kind of wrap their brains around that. And, especially since we're past the year 2000, for them to look back and say, okay, what is this guy looking at, and look where we're at now, and what would he think maybe of our society today? I was thinking about, talking about how long it takes to do something. I have a daughter that works in an industry that she doesn't have to necessarily work an 8-hour day, just as long as the job gets done.
Yeah.
And productivity, the idea of productivity changes in a technological economy, right? So in both directions, what a single person can do in a day, but also what like the capacity of I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but like General Motors at its height employed 600,000 people. These numbers are wrong, but Google at its height right now only employs 60,000 or something along those lines. Like the scale is it's a magnitude scale difference.
Yeah.
In when you have to do tactile, physical, manual production versus the kind of production that can happen in a technological society.
Absolutely. And Carnegie goes through some of that evolution.
He
so
does.
we can switch over to the
nicely done, Kirk.
Nice segue.
Hey, there you go. I've done this before. But no, yeah, and I think that evolution is important and interesting to think about too, because especially for students looking at the transition, because even during this period of heavy industrialization, more people still worked on farms, I think until the mid 1920s, than worked in factories and in cities, which continues to be, that's a significant factor. But they're also seeing these changes and seeing this evolution and the impacts of what that meant for the individuals who are working in these areas and Carnegie tries to wrestle with that a little bit. And I wonder what you both thought of what, his presentation of how industrialism swept over the nation, and whether or not you thought it was a fair representation, or is it certainly the representation of one of these, captains of industry who has been at the forefront of this evolution?
Well, he doesn't come from wealth, and he knows. I mean, his dad was a loom worker, and the Industrial Revolution kind of impoverished his family over there. His dad, he was working for rights and stuff of the workers, and that's when they decided to come here. So, he's not coming at this from not having experience with the poor and the industry and those kinds of things. So, I give him a little credit because, he's been there. It's not like he was born into wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think Carnegie's lifespan is really interesting too, because he was born in 1834, and so he's grown up through a lot of this change, right? So he's seen a lot of the evolutionary changes, and especially seeing a lot of his business moves take place during the Civil War, and then after that, I mean, he's seen a lot of that evolution, and so I think he has a very up close view of what this has looked like over time. But it's interesting here that he also focuses on discrepancies in wealth, right? And that's clearly something that's top of mind for him as he's thinking about it. And income inequality and wealth distribution are certainly things that are still very much discussed today. And he kind of makes a case for saying, look, this is true, but look at how much this discrepancy in wealth has actually benefited everyone, yes. Right? So even though those at the top, like Carnegie, are having much more wealth, so then do the people a little bit farther down the line. Their lives are also much more comfortable, which is very much a different a different approach than Bellamy was discussing.
And I think that a really good question to ask your students is, are the workers under these robber barons, are they better or worse because of these rich men? Are their lives better or worse? And I think Carnegie is pointing out, hey, look, these people are living in way better dwellings than even, the wealthy several generations ago were living in. And
so that's line 15. And I really think that line is interesting for students to parse, which is, he makes an argument that the irregularity, the wealth gap, is much better than universal squalor. And that's a challenge for a lot of people. And I think that students could really wrestle with that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, on line about 16 and
15,
17?
Yeah, 16,
yeah.
15, 16.
Where he says a relapse to the old conditions would be disastrous to both, not the least so to him who serves. What would their lives be like if they go back?
Right.
Yeah. I love that line too in conversation with Bellamy, just because he calls it out. It's like the good old times were not that good, right? As though, Bellamy here is looking back and saying, oh, that wasn't great, but it's almost the looking forward. It's perfect, right? Yeah. We'll get there. It's going to be great. Carnegie seems to be suggesting, look, there were no good old times, and there's not going to be any good old times. There's going to be a struggle here, and it's on us to recognize that the prosperity from the system has built into it some challenges that we need to overcome, which I think is a very different take on human nature too. And so that would be a question that I would ask you both too, or ask my students. How are these guys looking at human nature? Is it similarly, especially when we're talking about utopians, it's a very specific way of looking at how it is that humanity unfolds. Are there similarities? Are there differences? Are any lines jumping out from that perspective?
Well, I think for Carnegie, he's not a utopian. He's not utopianist. He's not a utopiist. Utopian. utopian. That's the word. He's not a utopian. It seems I mean, so I'm looking at lines like 32 through 45. So starting lines 32, that this idea in the change of the modes of production would mean that you'd get all of these goods that are relatively high quality at relatively low cost. The poor will enjoy what the rich could not before afford, where that what were luxuries have become the necessaries of life, right? Think the cell phone to the man of 1888 would have been extraordinarily luxury, right? And the cell phone rate of like the cell phone adoption rate in Africa was higher than the U.S. for a long time. They would the small cell phones with this, and the cell phone coverage was higher in the U.S. And so like the poor enjoy the riches that they could not afford. What were luxuries have become the necessaries of life. The laborer now has more comforts than the landlord had a few generations ago. But then he goes, I mean, so he says all these things are great, but the price we pay is great too, right? He's not a utopian. And the price we pay is this idea of castes.
Yeah, and you know, as you go down into about line 48, under the law of competition, the employer of thousands is forced into the strictest economies, among which the rates paid to labor figure prominently, and often there is friction between the employer and the employed.
Between capital and labor, the rich and poor.
Human society and these guys have got to make money or they go out of business. I mean, he points that out often in his writings, that, you know, you either make money or you go out of business, and then what happens to the labor?
And his argument there is that so we could all be alike in misery. So the human society loses the homogeneity, or the advantage is greater than the price of that struggle. For it is to this law we owe our wonderful material development, which brings improved conditions in its wake. And is that compelling, right? I mean, like, this is why the conversation with Bellamy is so interesting.
It's a big question to chew on.
Is that compelling? Or is Bellamy's utopian vision of equality compelling? Those are the interesting questions that these two documents bring together.
Yeah, and who makes a stronger case too, right? Who's stacking up their evidence in a way that is more compelling, right? Because I think that question there that Carnegie lays out his answer and is pretty clear about that. I think you could probably take that same question and ask Bellamy what the answer to that is, and let your students present that case too. But I think having that question be at the center of this discussion makes it really interesting, because again, they're both wrestling with a society that's going through these changes and seeing the impact that those changes have, and their conclusions about it seem to be different, right?
And that could make for a great in-class activity. Debate it, present their sides.
Whose argument is stronger? And
why? And working in the civil dialogue, as we teach them how to take on a different position and present that. These are two very different positions for them to be able to argue, and some very compelling on both sides.
Absolutely. And so then it transitions into this last section of this excerpt. So again, this is, I think, an excerpt as well. It might be, it's an excerpt from the Gospel of Wealth. So it's chunked and it's a much longer piece, but it wasn't published as a book. It was the Gospel of Wealth was a book, but I think this excerpt was separately published as a magazine article. So this article was published separately from Gospel of Wealth. Regardless, it then transitions into this argument of what? This last section from 56 to 75, let's start on 56. This statement, next one, the next 57. The rich man knows the best means of benefiting the community is to place within its reach the ladders upon which the aspiring can rise. So that's a stake in the ground that Carnegie put a lot of his wealth into, right? The Carnegie libraries, the Carnegie foundations, so much philanthropic infrastructure in the United States is founded on the principles which Carnegie modeled in his giving practices. That I think there's a long reach to him kind of staking this, that, the idea that the man who dies rich dies in disgrace. Like, you have a responsibility to give and to steward those less fortunate by providing these pleasures. And I found that
feels like he's a little guilty, doesn't it?
I'm not sure.
Like he feels, coming from the background he's coming from, that he feels that obligation to give back because he knows what he came from.
Interpreted this was based on my own experience. I taught at a school that was underwritten by a foundation, and the foundation received the foundation only funded projects that were in the county where the foundation founder had a plant. He was a manufacturer. And so he had manufacturing plants all over the country. And the foundation that he set up with his wealth would only fund projects in the county and the contiguous counties to those plants. Because his thought was that those were the people that allowed him to amass his wealth. And so those are the people who he was grateful to and who he thought deserved the benefits of those resources. So it wasn't really guilt, but more gratitude. And so that's how but again, I have this very particular experience where I taught in this private school that was underwritten by this donor who had that particular vision. So that struck me very similar to what Carnegie is describing here, that all of your workers, all of your employees are the ones so the way that that you have is to show them how much you appreciate what they do and what they give you by creating these inspirational places, right? So notice he's not saying build hospitals. I think he did build hospitals, but that's not what he says the responsibility is. He's not saying build bridges and roads, not build homes even.
Yeah, it's interesting. And to me, I think it's a great question for students, right? Because obviously, Rachel and Nicole, you both had a different perspective on that, right? And I think that's a rich discussion to go into, because what can you know from this one piece about Carnegie, right? We didn't go into really too much into what his rise was or challenges that he had, his reaction to certain riots or excuse me, not riots, but strikes that had happened in his plants, or even other things that took place in his life, right? So I think knowing that context, you can come at it from one way. Knowing a personal context, personal experience, you can bring that in. Reading just the words, you can look at it from that perspective. And here too, to me, it strikes me, only because I was looking at both of these authors for what their system was underlying it. To me, it seems like Carnegie wants to defend the system that allowed him to rise, right? So it seems as though he sees the prosperity and benefits that have come from his success within this system. And so he seems to think that the things that are underlying that need to be perpetuated, and this is his method of doing it, right? So it's the responsibility that follows from his own success. So whether that responsibility is motivated by gratitude, or whether it's motivated by guilt, or whether it's motivated by simply, whatever other means it may be, it certainly is clear that he does feel as though it is a responsibility that he needs to fulfill, which I think is interesting. And it seems that responsibility, the purpose of that responsibility is to perpetuate the system that has allowed for what he sees as being a massive benefit for the majority of of the country. Now, Bellamy obviously would disagree with that statement, right? Bellamy would come at it and say, no, this system is part of the problem, and it's creating this inequality of resources and material that is preventing what would be human nature prospering in some kind of different way or modality, I guess.
And for me, with Carnegie, what always jumps to mind is the library,
Yep.
the libraries. And, he self-educated when he got to America and then did night school. And so he sees the value of education, obviously, and allowing, knowledge is power, and allowing people to have access to that. Kirk, I think it's interesting too that you brought up that he writes this before the big Homestead strike.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes you wonder what his perspective would have been had he written this piece maybe right after that strike and everything that went along with that.
If you're looking for a really awesome lesson on the Homestead strike, Bill of Rights Institute's Gilded Age resource has a really cool role play on the Homestead strike where you have a narrator reading aloud the action of the strike, and there's workers in the Gilded Age is a unit in that resource, and that lesson is really cool. But I do think that's an interesting question. Had this been written, 20 years later, what would he have said the same things about the relations? I don't know, but I expect so. Because he really does see, that line in 65, that line 65, thus, if we recognize all of these things and the rich do their job of providing opportunities that will better the life of the workers, the problem of rich and poor will be solved. We'll keep going. Community relations is kind of the argument that I see here.
Yeah, but his solution is not the same as what Bellamy's would be. The
no,
problem
not at all.
with rich and poor would be solved is, going to be very different than what Bellamy is suggesting.
It's
Right.
two different visions of what solved means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
I think that's why they're really great to read together.
Absolutely.
I think some of his social Darwinism is coming out here too, in line about 69. The best minds will have you can see some of that influence coming out also.
And that also came out when he says that was line 69, but he also says that the rich man knows the best means of benefiting the community on line 58.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also there's a sense of lack of autonomy in the workers, that they're that social Darwinism idea that there's a reason that certain people get into positions of power, and therefore that power confers certain knowledge. I think we in modernity would take a statement. And I think it would be reasonable for students to take umbrage with that statement.
Yeah.
So, anything else on wealth or Bellamy?
I think that we found some great things to dive into. I can't believe it's already been 45 minutes. So
50 minutes.
So, but I think it shows the power of putting text like this in conversation with one another, because again, not only was this a rich dialogue and discussion that can add context to a historical conversation about what was happening at the time, but it can also be used to access conversations now that might otherwise be much more, how do I want to say, impassioned, right? Because if you can take it out of the current context and give something to grapple onto, sometimes that can be a good way of having those conversations without getting into every vagary of every political opinion that everybody may have, right? And so I think history can be a really interesting tool for that, particularly this period, because as I mentioned before, there are a lot of parallels between questions that the country was wrestling with then and now. So
absolutely.
With that, any final parting thoughts, Nicole or Rachel?
Rousing discussion.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you again in a few weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.